Its eyes then turned to the rich woman who was already in the boat, about to untie the ropes. The lion did not roar, did not attack. It merely positioned itself between her and freedom, a living statue of power and judgment. The fear the daughter-in-law felt was not of a bloodthirsty beast, but of a silent, relentless justice. Cornered by the guardian of the current, she knew that her fate now lay in the clutches of the very nature she had tried to exploit. The heavy, humid air of the bank seemed to vibrate with the presence of the albino lion. It was not a mirage, nor a feverish delirium of the rescued old woman. It was real, colossal, and its red eyes fixed on the rich woman in the boat with an intensity that chilled the soul. The daughter-in-law, still with her hands on the outboard motor, felt a shiver run down her spine, colder than the river water. Her perfect plan, meticulously orchestrated to inherit a fortune without a single scratch, crumbled before a beast that defied all logic. The lion, with the old woman still unconscious and drenched at its feet, did not make a single move. It did not roar, did not show its claws. It merely was there, a mountain of muscle and white fur, blocking the villain's only escape route. It was as if nature itself, a silent witness to the crime, had sent its most improbable guardian to demand a reckoning. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant murmur of the current and the frantic pounding of the rich woman's heart. She tried to start the motor again, a desperate reflex. The weak rumble of the small diesel engine tore through the silence for an instant, but the lion remained motionless. Its eyes, however, seemed to harden, and a slight tremor ran through its powerful muscles. It was not an explicit threat, but a tacit promise that any attempt to flee would be intercepted. The rich woman swallowed hard, the bitter taste of fear filling her mouth. She looked at her mother-in-law, fallen on the damp grass, and then at the bridge, now empty and silent, a monument to her failure. This is impossible," she murmured, her voice hoarse, almost inaudible. Her eyes swept the landscape, searching for any sign of life, any explanation for that aberration. There was no one. The dense, impenetrable forest seemed to watch her, complicit with the lion. She was alone, cornered by a mythical beast and her own guilty conscience. The old woman slowly began to cough, expelling muddy water. Her eyes opened, blurry and confused, and she blinked a few times before focusing on her daughter-in-law's face, which looked at her with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Then her eyes moved, finding the albino lion. There was no fear in them, only stunned surprise. The rich woman saw the scene and felt an even greater panic. Her mother-in-law was alive, and now a witness. You're alive." The question escaped the daughter-in-law's lips, more a statement than an interrogation. The old woman did not answer, merely tried to move, groaning in pain. The lion then made a subtle movement. Its head tilted slightly, and a low sound, almost a grunt, escaped its throat. It was not a threatening roar, but a warning, a declaration of possession. The rich woman interpreted it as an ultimatum. She looked at the boat's ropes, which still tied her to the bank. She could untie them, try to push the boat into the middle of the river, and pray for the current to carry her away. But the lion was there, a few feet away, an unshakable guardian. She imagined the claws, the teeth, the brute force of the beast. The idea of trying her luck against it was suicide. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of anguish. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long, distorted shadows over the scene. The beauty of the twilight contrasted cruelly with the terror that consumed the rich woman. She had planned everything, every detail, every alibi, but never, in her worst nightmares, had she foreseen an albino lion. The old woman coughed again, harder this time, and tried to sit up, leaning on the lion's massive body. The beast did not move, allowing the support. It was a surreal image, the victim and her savior, united against the villain. The rich woman felt a shiver of revulsion and despair. Not only her fortune was at stake now, but her freedom, her life. She leaned forward in the boat, her hands trembling. "What do you want?" she whispered to the lion, her voice choked. The beast merely watched her, its red eyes glowing in the growing gloom. There was no answer, only the silent promise of a justice that could not be bribed or deceived. The boat, once her ticket to freedom, now seemed like a floating trap. She was trapped between the beast and the river, and the twilight brought with it the certainty that the night would be long and full of unpredictable dangers. The rich woman's desperate whisper was lost in the heavy air, swallowed by the immensity of the forest and the murmur of the river. The albino lion, a sphinx of white fur and crimson eyes, offered no reply. It merely watched her, its massive and unshakable presence, a living block of marble that refused to yield. The villain's question, "What do you want?" echoed in her own mind. But there was no logic to this scene, no bargaining possible with a creature that seemed to have emerged from a nightmare or an ancient tale. Twilight advanced relentlessly, painting the river and trees with shades of deep purple and dark blue. Shadows lengthened, distorting familiar shapes, transforming every bush into a potential threat, every dry branch into a skeletal arm. The air, previously humid and heavy, now seemed to carry a biting cold, a premonition of the approaching night. The rich woman felt the hairs on her arms stand on end, not only from the cold, but from a growing sense of vulnerability. The boat, once a refuge, now seemed an easy target, floating at the mercy of a greater force. The old woman, still leaning on the lion's flank, coughed again, more forcefully, and a groan escaped her lips. Her eyes, previously cloudy, began to gain sharper focus. She moved her head slowly, observing her daughter-in-law in the boat, and a flash of understanding, mixed with horror, crossed her aged face. The memory of the push, the fall, the icy water seemed to be returning in painful fragments. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse, unintelligible sound came out. The daughter-in-law, seeing her mother-in-law's gaze, felt a new kind of terror. It was no longer just the fear of the beast or the failure of the plan, but the dread of the witness, of the silent accusation that would come from the lips of the woman she had tried to murder. Her mother-in-law was alive, and she was remembering. The lion, as if perceiving the change in the old woman's consciousness, made a subtle movement. Its head turned slightly towards the old woman, and it brushed its muzzle against her shoulder, an almost human gesture of protection. The old woman, in turn, raised a trembling hand to the lion's soft fur, as if seeking confirmation that this was not a delusion. The beast did not recoil, allowing the touch, reinforcing the surreal image of a guardian. "No, don't say anything," the rich woman whispered, her voice choked with panic, but the sound was muffled by the growing chorus of nocturnal insects that began to fill the air. She knew it was useless. Words could not erase what had happened, nor silence the truth the old woman now carried. Her eyes swept the bank, desperately searching for an exit, a crack, anything that could break the siege. But the forest was an impenetrable wall, and the lion a living fortress. The boat's motor, which she had tried to start earlier, now seemed a cruel joke. The weak sound it produced would be inaudible at any distance, and the force of the current would be insignificant against the lion's determination. She was trapped, and the rapidly settling darkness of the night only increased the feeling of claustrophobia. Stars began to dot the sky, distant and indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. Suddenly, the old woman let out a stronger groan and tried to stand up completely. The lion, with surprising agility for its size, moved slightly, offering support with its body. The old woman managed to sit up, her legs still weak, But her eyes were now fixed on her daughter-in-law, full of a mixture of pain and contained anger. The rich woman felt a shiver run down her spine. Her mother-in-law was no longer the fragile, dependent figure she knew. There was a new strength in her gaze, a determination the villain had never seen before. The lion then did something that made the rich woman's heart stop. It turned completely towards the boat, and for the first time opened its mouth, revealing long, sharp fangs like knives. There was no roar, only a low, guttural sound, a primal warning that vibrated in the air and made the river water tremble slightly. Its red eyes, now more intense in the growing darkness, fixed on hers with an unmistakable promise of violence. The message was clear: the beast's patience was wearing thin. The rich woman instinctively recoiled in the boat, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could smell the wet earth and the forest, mixed with a wild, untamed scent emanating from the lion. The air felt denser, laden with an imminent threat. She was not just cornered, she was being hunted. And the night, which now completely covered the landscape, brought with it the certainty that the cat and mouse game was about to turn into something much darker and deadlier. The sight of the fangs, white as obsidian and sharp as newly honed knives, froze the rich woman's blood. It was not a roar, but the guttural sound, a deep growl that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, vibrated in her chest, reverberating in the humid night air. The river water, previously a distant murmur, now seemed to tremble in sync with the primal threat. The lion's red eyes, intensified by the growing darkness, were beacons of contained fury, fixed on her with an unmistakable promise of violence. She recoiled instinctively, her body pressed against the stern of the boat, feeling the cold, damp wood against her back. Her hands, previously gripping the steering wheel tightly, now trembled uncontrollably, her knuckles white like the beast's teeth. The smell of wet earth and the forest mixed with a wild, untamed scent emanating from the lion, a smell of predator, of raw and unquestionable power. The air felt denser, heavy with an imminent threat. She was not just cornered, she was being hunted. And the night, which now completely covered the landscape, brought with it the certainty that the cat and mouse game was about to turn into something much darker and deadlier. The lion, as if understanding the old woman's intention, took a slow, deliberate step, its enormous paws sinking slightly into the damp grass. Every fiber of its being radiated a contained threat, a predator that had found its prey and would not allow its escape. Its eyes never left the rich woman, and the low, continuous growl emanating from its throat was a constant reminder of its presence and its dwindling patience. The rich woman's panic reached a new level. Her mother-in-law was alive, conscious and accusing her. The lion was her guardian, a potential judge and executioner. She looked at the boat's oar, an insane and desperate idea surfacing in her mind. Could she use it to push the boat into the middle of the river, or in a fit of madness try to ward off the beast? The idea was suicide, but desperation knew no logic. "No, please," she whispered, her voice choked with fear, the words lost in the cold night air. She didn't know whom she was pleading with, the lion, her mother-in-law, or some divine force that seemed to have abandoned her. The forest, a dark and murmuring mass, seemed to mock her insignificance, its nocturnal sounds. The rustling of leaves, the croaking of frogs, the buzzing of insects, forming a macabre chorus for her ordeal. The old woman, with superhuman effort, managed to sit up a little straighter, still leaning on the lion. Her lips moved, and this time a more audible sound escaped. "You," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and weak, but laden with a pain and indignation that cut through the air more than any roar. "You pushed me." Those words, whispered and almost inaudible, were like thunder to the rich woman. The truth, previously a dark secret in her mind, was now being spoken, witnessed by a mythical beast and by nature itself. There was no more denying it, no more escaping the accusation. The lion, as if the old woman's words were a command, took another step forward, further narrowing the distance between it and the boat. The growl in its throat intensified, and it tilted its head slightly, its red eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to penetrate her soul. The rich woman could feel the beast's warm breath, the air heavy with the smell of savagery. She cringed, her nails scratching the wood of the boat in her desperate attempt to pull away. The motor, once her only hope of escape, now seemed a useless toy. She was trapped, cornered, and the darkness of the night offered no hiding place, only amplified the terror. The image of the lion, an imposing silhouette against the star-dotted night sky, seemed the personification of relentless justice. There was no more time for plans, for alibis. The hunter had become the hunted, and the predator watching her was not made of flesh and bone, but of an older, untamed force. The boat, once a symbol of freedom, was now her floating tomb. She was at the mercy of the beast, and twilight had given way to a dark and cold night, where only the lion and the old woman seemed to control fate. Silence fell again, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart and the low, constant growl emanating from the albino guardian. The rich woman closed her eyes, but the image of the sharp fangs and red eyes remained etched in her mind. The night would be long. The night would be long, and the silence that followed the old woman's whispered accusation was heavier than any roar. It infiltrated the rich woman's soul, freezing her from the inside out. Her eyes, previously closed in despair, now snapped open, fixing on the albino lion, which, like a living statue of fury, remained motionless, yet with a presence that filled all space. The low, constant growl emanating from the beast's throat was the only sound that dared to break the oppressive stillness, a primordial heartbeat that seemed synchronized with the growing terror in her own chest. The rich woman could feel cold sweat trickling down her temples, the metallic scent of fear on her own skin. The boat, once a refuge, was now a floating trap, swaying slightly in the current, a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. She looked at her mother-in-law, who, though weak and drenched, kept her gaze fixed on her, a mixture of pain, betrayal, and a newfound strength in her eyes. The image of the old woman leaning on the lion's flank was surreal, almost biblical, as if nature itself had risen to witness and judge. The lion then took another step, slow, deliberate, its enormous paws sinking into the damp grass of the bank, each movement calculated, every fiber of its body radiating power. The growl intensified, transforming into a deeper, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air, making the leaves of distant trees rustle as if in response. Its red eyes, now brighter in the almost total darkness, were like incandescent embers, fixed on the rich woman with an intensity that seemed to strip her soul bare, revealing the villainy contained within. The rich woman's panic reached a new peak. She recoiled further into the stern of the boat, feeling the cold, rough wood against her back. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, her knuckles white from gripping the useless steering wheel. She desperately searched for an exit. Anything. The oar, tossed in the bottom of the boat, seemed a cruel joke, an insignificant tool against the colossal force staring at her. The forest behind the lion was a dark, impenetrable mass. Its nocturnal sounds, the croaking of frogs, the buzzing of insects, the distant rustling of treetops, seemed to form a macabre chorus for her ordeal. "No, please," she whispered again, her voice choked, almost inaudible, the words lost in the cold, damp air. She didn't know whom she was pleading with. The beast, her mother-in-law, or some divine force that seemed to have abandoned her in that moment. Shame and terror mingled in an overwhelming wave. She, the rich and powerful woman, accustomed to controlling everything and everyone, was now at the mercy of a wild creature and an old woman she had tried to murder. The lion, as if tired of waiting, took another step, and this time its front paw landed on the edge of the boat. A dry, hollow sound echoed in the night, and the boat swayed violently. The rich woman let out a muffled cry, her heart pounding in her chest, feeling the impact of the beast's force. The paw, enormous and covered in white fur, was a terrifying sight. Its retractable claws, though not exposed, were a promise of destruction. The lion's growl grew louder, more menacing, a sound that seemed to tear the fabric of the night. The old woman, observing the scene, coughed again, a hoarse, painful sound that, however, contained a hint of dark satisfaction. Her eyes, previously clouded with pain, now shone with an unsettling clarity, fixed on her daughter-in-law. She said nothing, but her presence, her gaze, were a condemnation more potent than any court. The lion, her improbable guardian, seemed to understand the message, the need for justice. The rich woman tried to move away from the lion's paw, but there was nowhere to go. The boat was small, and the beast occupied the entire bank. She could smell the wild scent of the lion, an odor of earth, moss, and predator, mixed with the smell of river water and her own fear. The darkness of the night seemed to close around her, suffocating her. There was no light, only the lion's red eyes and the distant gleam of the stars, indifferent to her torment. In a surge of desperation, she grabbed the oar. It was a futile gesture, she knew, but the instinct for self-preservation was stronger than reason. She held it like a weapon, her hands trembling so much that the wood rattled. She thought of pushing the lion, of trying to ward it off, but the idea was insane. The beast was colossal, untamed. The lion tilted its head, its red eyes fixed on the oar, then on her, as if evaluating her pathetic attempt at defense. A low sound, almost a snort, escaped its nostrils, and then, with a swift and surprising movement, it opened its mouth again. This time, there was no growl. There was a roar, a primal, booming sound that echoed through the forest, making nocturnal birds take flight in panic and the boat sway violently. The sound was so powerful that the rich woman felt it vibrate in her bones, in every cell of her body. It was the sound of nature, of savage justice, and it was directed at her. She dropped the oar, which fell with a dull thud to the bottom of the boat. Her hands went to her ears, but the roar seemed to come from within herself. She was on the verge of collapse, terrified, cornered, hopeless. The lion, having made its declaration, withdrew its paw from the boat, but did not move away. It remained there, an imposing silhouette against the night sky, its red eyes still fixed on her, a promise that the night was just beginning and that the price of her betrayal was about to be exacted. The old woman by its side watched everything, a silent and relentless witness. The hunter had become the hunted, and the predator watching her was not made of flesh and bone, but of an older, untamed force. The albino lion's roar was not just a sound, it was a primordial shockwave that swept through the night, tearing the veil of darkness and penetrating the rich woman's very soul. She felt it vibrate in every bone, in every fiber of her being, a guttural thunder that seemed to come from within herself, echoing the terror that consumed her. The oar, previously a pathetic attempt at defense, fell from her trembling hands with a dull thud, sinking to the bottom of the boat, as useless as her own will to resist. Her hands went to her ears, but the sound seemed inescapable, an invisible force crushing her. The boat swayed violently with the force of the reverberation, and she cringed, her eyes wide, fixed on the imposing silhouette of the beast. The lion, having made its declaration of power, withdrew its paw from the edge of the boat, but did not move away. It remained there, a mountain of muscle and white fur, its red eyes like incandescent embers, still fixed on her, a promise that the night was just beginning and that the price of her betrayal was about to be exacted. The old woman, beside the lion, watched everything. Her face, previously pale and marked by pain, now bore an expression of serene, almost chilling satisfaction. Her eyes, previously cloudy, shone with an unsettling clarity, fixed on her daughter-in-law. She said nothing, but her presence, her gaze, were a condemnation more potent than any court, a silent judgment delivered by the victim and witnessed by nature itself. The silence that followed the roar was even more oppressive, filled only by the frantic pounding of the rich woman's heart and the low, constant growl emanating from the lion's throat. She could smell the wild scent of the beast, an odor of damp earth, moss, and predator mixed with the smell of river water and her own fear, a metallic and pungent odor. The darkness of the night seemed to close around her, suffocating her, offering no hiding place, only amplifying her torment. The lion took another step, this time not forward, but to the side, moving slowly along the bank, parallel to the boat. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, as if it were circling its prey, cutting off any illusion of escape. Its red eyes never left her, and the growl intensified with each step, a constant reminder of its overwhelming presence. The rich woman recoiled further into the stern of the boat, feeling the cold, damp wood against her back. There was nowhere to go. The river, once her accomplice, was now an impassable barrier, its dark, icy waters seeming more menacing than welcoming. The forest, an impenetrable mass of shadows behind the lion, was a labyrinth of unknown dangers, and the boat, her last refuge, was now a floating cell. In her mind, fragmented images of her life passed like a distorted film, the opulence of her mansion, the glittering jewels, the power she wielded over others. Everything seemed so distant now, so insignificant before the brutal and relentless force staring at her. The ease with which she had pushed her mother-in-law from the bridge, the coldness of her calculation, all of it now turned against her, a macabre echo in her conscience. The lion stopped, right in front of the boat's bow. It tilted its head slightly, and a low sound, almost a snort, escaped its nostrils. Then, with a movement that was both slow and terrifyingly swift, it opened its mouth again. This time, there was no roar. Instead, it exposed its fangs, long, sharp, and white as ivory, a chilling contrast against the darkness of its mouth. The air around her seemed to freeze. Those fangs were the promise of a brutal end, a sight that etched itself into her mind with terrifying clarity. The rich woman let out a muffled scream, a hoarse, desperate sound that was lost in the immensity of the night. She closed her eyes, but the image of the fangs remained, burning on her retina. She could feel the beast's warm, heavy breath, the smell of meat and savagery emanating from its open mouth. Panic reached an unbearable level, and she felt on the verge of collapse, her mind wavering between reality and nightmare. The lion, as if it had assessed her terror, closed its mouth with an audible click that made her flinch. But it did not move away. Instead, it took a step forward, and this time its front paw landed firmly on the bow of the boat. The impact was stronger than before, and the boat swayed violently, almost capsizing. The rich woman clung to the edges, her nails scratching the wood, her body trembling uncontrollably. The paw, enormous and powerful, seemed ready to tear the boat apart, to drag her out to the inevitable encounter with her fate. She was trapped, cornered, and the darkness of the night offered no hiding place, only amplified the terror. The image of the lion, an imposing silhouette against the star-dotted night sky, seemed the personification of relentless justice. There was no more time for plans, for alibis. The hunter had become the hunted, and the predator watching her was not made of flesh and bone, but of an older, untamed force. The boat, once a symbol of freedom, was now her floating tomb. She was at the mercy of the beast, and twilight had given way to a dark and cold night. where only the lion and the old woman seemed to control fate. The night would be long, the night would be long, and the lion, with its paw firmly planted in the boat, seemed ready to drag her to the bank, to the final encounter with savagery and retribution. The night would be long, and the lion, with its paw firmly planted on the bow of the boat, not only seemed ready to drag her to the bank, it began to do so. A low, deep growl vibrated in its chest, a sound not of explosive rage, but of cold, relentless determination. The paw, enormous and covered in white fur, exerted colossal pressure, and the claws, though not fully extended, scratched the wet wood with a harsh, sinister sound. The boat, already unstable, tilted dangerously to one side, and the rich woman let out a muffled scream, desperately clinging to the edges, her nails breaking against the damp wood. The river current, previously a silent ally in her macabre plan, now seemed to fight against the lion, but the beast's strength was undeniable. Slowly, inch by inch, the boat began to move, not downstream but towards the bank, towards the darkness of the forest and the inevitable encounter with the predator. Each scratch of the paw on the wood was a sound that echoed in her soul, a drumming of her own condemnation. She could feel the cold river water lapping at the edge of the boat, threatening to engulf her, while the wild scent of the lion grew more intense, a mixture of earth, moss, and the metallic odor of raw meat. Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the old woman, who remained motionless beside the lion. Her mother-in-law's face, illuminated only by the distant gleam of the stars, was a mask of serene observation. There was no explicit hatred, no noisy triumph, only an unsettling stillness that spoke of a justice beyond human comprehension. Her eyes, previously clouded with pain, now shone with a clarity that seemed to penetrate the very darkness, fixed on her daughter-in-law with an intensity that was more painful than any verbal accusation. The rich woman felt a shiver run down her spine, a terror that went beyond the physical fear of the lion. It was the terror of being seen, of being judged by her victim. The lion took another step, dragging the boat closer. The bow scraped against the damp sand of the bank with a screeching sound, and the boat stopped, caught between the lion's force and the inertia of the land. The rich woman was now a few feet from the beast, so close she could make out the white strands of fur in its mane, the moisture in its nostrils, the abyssal depth of its red eyes. The lion's growl intensified, a guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, and she felt the ground beneath the boat vibrate with the beast's force. In a surge of desperate panic, she tried to push the boat away from the bank, using her feet against the bottom of the vessel. But it was useless. The lion had completely cornered her. The river, once her accomplice, was now an impassable barrier, its dark, icy waters seeming more menacing than welcoming. The forest, an impenetrable mass of shadows behind the lion, was a labyrinth of unknown dangers, and the boat, her last refuge, was now a floating cell, anchored by a gigantic paw. Her mind spun in a whirlwind of despair. Images of her luxurious life, her opulent mansion, the glittering jewels, and the power she wielded over others all seemed so distant now, so insignificant before the brutal and relentless force staring at her. The ease with which she had pushed her mother-in-law from the bridge, the coldness of her calculation, all of it now turned against her, a macabre echo in her conscience. She had underestimated nature, underestimated life, and now nature was exacting its price. The lion tilted its head, its red eyes fixed on hers, as if reading her innermost thoughts, assessing her terror. It let out a low snort, and then, with a slow and deliberate movement, it lifted its paw from the boat. For an instant, a tiny spark of hope flickered in the rich woman's heart. Perhaps it would move away, perhaps there was a chance. But that hope was crushed the next moment. Instead of moving away, the lion took a step back, moving away from the boat, but only enough for the old woman to move. With visible effort, the old woman, still leaning on the lion's flank, began to drag herself forward towards the bow of the boat. Each movement was slow and painful, but determined. Her eyes never left her, and the rich woman felt an even greater dread than she had felt from the lion. The beast was a predator, but the old woman was the personification of her own guilt, coming to collect her debt. The old woman reached the edge of the boat, her gnarled and wrinkled hands gripping it with surprising strength. Her eyes, previously only observing, now carried an intensity that made her recoil further into the stern. She did not say a word, but her proximity, her gaze, were a condemnation more potent than any court. The lion, her improbable guardian, remained by her side, a mountain of muscle and white fur, its red eyes like incandescent embers, still fixed on the rich woman, a promise that the night was just beginning and that the price of her betrayal was about to be exacted. The hunter had become the hunted, and the predator watching her was not made of flesh and bone, but of an older, untamed force, a force that now confronted her through the eyes of her victim. The old woman, with her gnarled and wrinkled hands, gripped the edge of the boat with a strength that belied her fragility. Her eyes, previously clouded by pain and shock, now shone with a disturbing clarity, fixed on her daughter-in-law with an intensity that seemed to tear the rich woman's soul from her. There was no explicit anger, nor the fury one would expect from someone who had just been betrayed and almost murdered. There was only an unsettling stillness, a serenity that spoke of a justice beyond human comprehension, a silent condemnation that was more potent than any scream. The rich woman felt a chilling shiver run down her spine, a terror that went beyond the physical fear of the lion. It was the terror of being seen, of being judged by her victim, of having her naked soul exposed under the unyielding gaze of the one she had tried to silence forever. Her lips trembled, and she tried to form words, an apology, a justification, anything to break that oppressive silence, but her throat was dry, her voice caught in a knot of panic. A hoarse, muffled sound escaped, more a lament than a word, and was lost in the immensity of the night. The lion, a mountain of muscle and white fur, remained beside the old woman, its red eyes, like incandescent embers, still fixed on the rich woman. It was the improbable guardian, the silent executioner, and its presence amplified the atmosphere of condemnation. Every fiber of the rich woman's being screamed for escape, but the river, dark and icy, was an impassable barrier, and the forest, an impenetrable mass of shadows, promised even greater dangers. The boat, her last refuge, was now a floating cell, anchored by the beast's gigantic paw and the old woman's relentless gaze. In her mind, fragmented images of her life passed like a distorted film. The opulence of her mansion, the glittering jewels, the power she wielded over others, everything seemed so distant now, so insignificant before the brutal and relentless force staring at her. The ease with which she had pushed her mother-in-law from the bridge, the coldness of her calculation, all of it now turned against her, a macabre echo in her conscience. She had underestimated nature, underestimated life, and now nature was exacting its price in a way she could never have imagined. The old woman, with a slow and deliberate movement, tilted her head slightly. There was no smile, no nod of triumph, just the same observant stillness. But in that small gesture, the rich woman felt a depth of knowledge, an understanding of her guilt that made her recoil further into the stern of the boat, trying in vain to escape that penetrating gaze. The air around her seemed to grow denser, laden with the weight of her actions, the wild scent of the lion, a mixture of earth, moss, and the metallic odor of raw meat became suffocating, mingling with the damp aroma of the river and the smell of her own fear. The night would be long. The lion, with its paw firmly planted on the bow of the boat, not only seemed ready to drag her to the bank, It had already done so. The boat was stuck, and the rich woman was a few feet from the beast. So close she could make out the white strands of fur in its mane, the moisture in its nostrils, the abyssal depth of its red eyes. The lion's growl, previously a distant guttural sound, now vibrated in her chest, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, and she felt the ground beneath the boat vibrate with the beast's force. The old woman, without taking her eyes off her, let out a sigh. It was not a sigh of relief, nor of weariness, but a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of hurt and disillusionment. Then, with visible effort, she slowly raised one of her wrinkled hands. The rich woman held her breath, her eyes wide, fixed on the movement. The hand, trembling but determined, reached forward, not to touch but to point. The index finger, curved by age, pointed directly at the rich woman's heart. A mute gesture that spoke louder than any accusation. It was a wordless condemnation, a verdict delivered by the victim herself. The rich woman felt an even more intense cold, not from the water or the wind, but from a deep and painful recognition of her own depravity. She had tried to extinguish the old woman's life, but now it was the old woman who was extinguishing hers, not with violence, but with the relentless force of truth. The lion, as if understanding the meaning of the gesture, let out a low, deep growl, a sound that seemed to agree with the sentence. Panic reached an unbearable level. The rich woman felt on the verge of collapse, her mind wavering between reality and nightmare. She closed her eyes for an instant, but the image of her mother-in-law's accusing finger and the lion's red eyes remained etched on her retina. She was trapped, cornered, and the darkness of the night offered no hiding place, only amplified the terror. The hunter had become the hunted, and the predator watching her was not made of flesh and bone, but of an older, untamed force. A force that now confronted her through the eyes of her victim and the accusing finger of her own conscience. The night would be long, and the price of her betrayal was just beginning to be exacted. The mother-in-law's accusing finger, curved by age and pain, yet firm in its direction, was a bolt that struck her to the core. There were no screams, no tears, just that deadly stillness. And the rich woman felt the air sucked from her lungs. Her heart pounded erratically against her ribs, a frantic drum in the darkness. The silence that followed the gesture was more deafening than any roar, more penetrating than any verbal accusation. It was the silence of undeniable truth, of exposed guilt, of condemnation without appeal. She tried to look away, but her eyes were magnetized by the finger, by the trembling hand, by the old woman's eyes that seemed to see through her soul, laying bare every vile thought, every cold calculation that had led her to that precipice. The image of her mother-in-law falling from the bridge, the muddy water swallowing her fragile figure, replayed in her mind with nauseating clarity. In that moment, she had felt a perverse relief, the promise of golden freedom. Now, that freedom had transformed into a prison of terror. The lion, a mountain of white fur and tense muscles, seemed to absorb the energy of that moment, its red eyes glowing with an intensity that rivaled the embers of a private hell. It let out a low growl, almost a deep purr, but one that resonated in the rich woman's chest like distant thunder. It was not a sound of anger, but of an ancestral understanding, of a judgment that transcended human morality. It was nature, the primordial force, and it was there to ensure the scales were balanced. The rich woman felt the boat sway slightly beneath her, a cruel reminder of her precarious position. She was trapped between the icy river and the bank, where justice, in its wildest and most relentless form, awaited her. The forest behind the lion seemed to breathe, its shadows extending like long, menacing fingers, and the damp smell of the earth mingled with the wild scent of the beast, creating a symphony of terror that suffocated her. In a final surge of desperation, She tried to move the boat, pushing her feet against the bottom, but the lion's paw was firmly planted on the bow, a living, unmovable anchor. It was useless. She was at their mercy. Her mind, once so sharp and calculating, was now a whirlwind of panic and regret. The jewels, the mansion, the power, everything seemed a cruel joke, a distant and unreal dream before the brutal reality confronting her. The old woman, with an effort that seemed superhuman, moved slightly. She did not stand up, nor approach the boat, but merely adjusted her position as if to get a better view of her daughter-in-law. Her eyes, once so full of pain and fragility, were now pools of cold, unshakable determination. She needed no words to express her condemnation. Every fiber of her being radiated a truth the rich woman could no longer ignore. The lion, as if in response to the old woman's movement, took a lateral step, not to move away, but to position itself even more imposingly, its massive body blocking any view of escape into the forest. Its muscles contracted and relaxed under the white fur, and the rich woman could feel the raw power of the beast, the force that could crush her in an instant. It was a macabre dance where every movement, every glance, every growl was part of a ritual of punishment. Time seemed to have stopped, each second stretched into an eternity of dread. The rich woman felt her throat dry, her heart pounding, her hands sweaty and trembling. She wanted to scream, to beg, to confess, but no words could break through the barrier of terror that enveloped her. She was trapped in a waking nightmare, and the darkness of the night was a veil that hid the world, leaving her alone with her demons and her unusual tormentors. Suddenly, the old woman made another movement. With agonizing slowness, she raised her other hand, the one that was not pointing. With her fingertips, she gently touched the lion's flank, a gesture of affection and gratitude that seemed completely out of place in that scene of horror. The lion, in response, tilted its head slightly, its red eyes never leaving the rich woman, but a soft sound, almost a purr, escaped its throat. The rich woman felt an even deeper chill. It was not just the lion that was cornering her, but nature itself, in collusion with the victim. That touch, that silent connection between the old woman and the beast, was the final proof that she had disturbed a greater order, an order that now turned against her with a silent and relentless fury. She looked at the river, at the darkness of the waters, and for an instant the idea of throwing herself into the current seemed a relief, an escape from that unbearable torment. But the river was cold, treacherous, and the forest an impenetrable mass of dangers. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to flee. She was completely cornered, her fate sealed by the gigantic paw of an albino lion and the unyielding gaze of her mother-in-law. The lion, as if it had read her thoughts of escape, let out a deeper growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very waters of the river. It moved the paw that was on the boat, not to release it, but to drag it a little further towards the bank, scraping the keel in the mud. The boat shuddered, and the rich woman was thrown forward, almost falling. She clung to the edges, her heart in her mouth, her face pale with terror. The old woman, still pointing her finger, watched everything, her lips thin and pale, but her eyes, oh, her eyes were the very personification of silent vengeance. The night was far from over, and the rich woman knew, with a cold and terrible certainty, that the darkness still held horrors she could barely conceive. The price of her betrayal was being exacted, drop by drop, with every beat of her terrified heart. The boat, now almost completely beached, scraped against the damp mud of the bank, a drawn-out, agonizing sound that echoed the rich woman's state. She was so close to the beast that she could feel the heat emanating from its massive body, the wild, potent scent filling her lungs, mingling with the ferrous odor of fear that now completely dominated her. The lion's red eyes, previously just a distant threat, were now pools of flame devouring her, unblinking, without a single sign of hesitation. The gigantic paw, still holding the boat, seemed like an imposing rock, and she could make out the retractable claws, sharp as razors, promising a terrible fate. The old woman, a few feet away, maintained her posture, her finger still pointing, a living statue of condemnation. There was no tremor in her hand, only a chilling firmness that pierced her. The touch she had given the lion's flank, that gesture of affection and complicity, had sealed the rich woman's fate. It was not just a wild animal. It was an executioner, a guardian of an ancestral justice that she, in her arrogance, had ignored. That lion was not just a predator, it was an extension of the victim's will, an instrument of a reckoning that transcended human understanding. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint murmur of the river and the sound of the rich woman's own ragged breathing. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry, scratchy. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would explode from her chest, and blood pulsed in her temples. The panic, which had been a wave, was now a tsunami, dragging her into the depths of endless despair. She looked at the dark forest, an impenetrable mass of shadows and mysteries, and at the river, a cold and treacherous current. There was nowhere to go, no glimmer of hope, only the inevitability of that confrontation. The lion, as if enjoying the spectacle of her terror, let out a low, prolonged growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air, making the hairs on the rich woman's arm stand on end. It moved its head slightly, its red eyes fixed on hers, and then, with a calculated slowness that was more terrifying than any sudden attack, it lifted its paw from the boat. The rich woman held her breath. For a fleeting instant, a spark of hope flickered in her chest. Would this be the end? Would it let her go? But hope was crushed the next instant. The lion did not move away. Instead, it took a step back, not to release the boat, but to position itself even more imposingly, its massive body now completely out of reach of the water, blocking any view beyond it. It was there, a mountain of white fur watching her, and then the old woman made a movement. With the same agonizing slowness, she lowered the pointing hand, not to give up the accusation, but to extend her open palm towards the lion. The animal, in response, tilted its head again, and a deep, almost inaudible purr escaped its throat. It was a silent communication, an exchange of understanding that the rich woman could not decipher, but which she felt in every fiber of her being as a sentence. The old woman then, with visible effort, tried to stand up. Her legs trembled, and she leaned on the lion, which remained motionless, a pillar of strength. Slowly, painfully, she stood, her eyes fixed on her daughter-in-law. The fragility of her body was contrasted by the unshakable strength of her gaze. She was no longer the helpless victim. She was the personification of retribution, supported by nature itself. The rich woman felt herself shrink in the boat. The sight of the old woman standing with the lion by her side as a guardian was the most terrifying image she had ever witnessed. It was as if the world had turned upside down, and the natural order of things had been subverted to punish her. She tried to recoil, but the boat was stuck in the mud, and there was nowhere to go. The lion then took another step, this time towards the boat. It was not a run, not a leap, but a slow and deliberate advance, each paw lifted and placed with frightening precision. The ground trembled slightly under the beast's weight. The rich woman could see the tension in the lion's muscles, the way its body moved with a lethal grace. It was not coming to attack her immediately, it was coming to reach her. Terror reached a new level. She let out a small moan, a muffled sound that was lost in the immensity of the night. Her eyes swept the scene in search of an exit, anything, but there was nothing. The darkness of the forest seemed to swallow her. The river rejected her, and before her, savage justice advanced. The old woman, now completely standing, took a step forward too, her eyes never leaving her daughter-in-law. She needed no words. Her gaze, her posture, the presence of the lion by her side, all spoke of a condemnation the rich woman could no longer deny. The price of her betrayal was being exacted, not in money or goods, but in pure, relentless terror. The night was far from over, and the true judgment was just beginning. The lion's slow, deliberate advance was torture in motion, each step a hammer blow to the rich woman's soul. The damp ground of the bank groaned under the beast's weight, and the muffled sound of its massive paws echoed in the night's silence, amplified by the dread that consumed her. She was paralyzed, her muscles rigid, the air trapped in her lungs. Her eyes, wide open, could not tear away from the mountain of white fur approaching, every fiber of her being screaming to flee, but her body refused to obey. The lion did not run, did not leap. It walked with an implacable gravity, as if time and space bent to its will. With each step, the figure of the old woman beside it seemed to gain more strength, more imposing stature. She was no longer the fragile, defenseless victim the rich woman had pushed to her death. She was the personification of retribution, a dark and powerful figure supported by nature itself. Her eyes, once so full of pain, now radiated a cutting coldness, a silent condemnation more terrifying than any scream or threat. The boat, stuck in the mud, was a perfect trap. The rich woman tried to move, but her hands slipped on the damp edges, and her feet seemed glued to the bottom. She could feel the heat emanating from the lion's body, the wild, potent scent of the beast filling her lungs, mingling with the ferocious odor of fear that now completely dominated her. The lion's red eyes, previously just a distant threat, were now pools of flame devouring her, unblinking, without a single sign of hesitation. She could distinguish the retractable claws, sharp as razors, promising a terrible fate. The lion stopped a few inches from the boat. Its massive head was now level with the rich woman's eyes, and she could see every detail: the bristling white fur, the long, sensitive whiskers, the moisture on its muzzle, and, above all, those eyes, which seemed to penetrate her soul, stripping bare every lie, every act of cruelty. A low guttural growl escaped the lion's throat, a sound that vibrated in the very air, making the hairs on the rich woman's arm stand on end. It was not a roar of fury, but a sound of warning, of possession, of a judgment that was about to be delivered. The old woman, still standing beside the lion, extended her hand again, not to touch the beast, but to point at the boat, at the rich woman. There was no tremor in her hand, only a chilling firmness that pierced her. It was a gesture of accusation, a mute sentence that the lion seemed to understand perfectly. The connection between them was undeniable, supernatural. That lion was not just a predator, it was an executioner, a guardian of an ancestral justice that she, in her arrogance, had ignored. The old woman took another step forward, her eyes fixed on her daughter-in-law. She needed no words. Her gaze, her posture, the presence of the lion by her side, all spoke of a condemnation the rich woman could no longer deny. The price of her betrayal was being exacted, not in money or possessions, but in pure, relentless terror. The night was far from over, and the true judgment was just beginning. The lion then did something that made her hold her breath, a movement that sealed her fate with a cold and unshakable certainty. It extended one of its front paws, not to attack, but to touch the edge of the boat, its retractable claws grazing the wood with a soft sound, almost a whisper, but which to the rich woman sounded like the tearing of her own shroud. The claw grazing the wood of the boat was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. Not a scream, not a roar, but a lethal whisper that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night. The rich woman felt her heart plummet in her chest, a chilling emptiness spreading through her veins. It was the touch of death, the promise of an end she had tried to impose on another, and which now turned against her with relentless ferocity. The lion, did not withdraw its paw. Instead, it pressed it gently against the edge of the boat, a colossal weight that made the vessel creak and sink deeper into the sticky mud. The boat tilted dangerously, and the rich woman, already cowering, slid to one side, hitting her shoulder against the hull. A sharp pain shot through her, but it was insignificant compared to the terror that consumed her. She could feel the vibration of the lion's body through the wood, a raw, wild energy that enveloped her, suffocating her. The beast's red eyes were inches from hers, pools of fire that seemed to burn her soul. She could see the distorted reflection of her own pale, terrified face in those mesmerizing irises. The lion's warm breath, with a wild, earthy scent, hit her face, making her recoil instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped, cornered, at the mercy of that creature that seemed to have emerged from a nightmare. The old woman, still standing beside the lion, kept her gaze fixed on her daughter-in-law. There was no anger in her eyes, not even the triumph the rich woman expected. There was only a cutting coldness, a dark resignation that spoke of a justice that needed no emotions. She was the silent witness, the accuser who needed no words, for the lion itself was her voice, her strength, her instrument of retribution. The lion then did something even more disturbing. It tilted its head, and its massive muzzle, damp and warm, brushed the edge of the boat, right beside the rich woman's hand. She could feel the bristling fur, the rough texture of the animal's skin. It was an intimate contact, an invasion of her personal space that was more terrifying than any attack. It was a demonstration of absolute control, a reminder that it could do whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted. A low, prolonged growl escaped the lion's throat, a sound that seemed to vibrate in her bones, making her tremble uncontrollably. It was not a growl of immediate threat, but a sound of warning, of possession, of a judgment that was about to be delivered. The rich woman closed her eyes for an instant, wishing it were all a nightmare, that she would wake up in her luxurious bed, far from that muddy river and that white beast. But when she opened them again, the brutal reality remained. The old woman took another step forward, her bare feet sinking slightly into the mud. She extended her hand again, not to touch the beast, but to point at the boat, at the rich woman. There was no tremor in her hand, only a chilling firmness that pierced her. It was a gesture of accusation, a mute sentence that the lion seemed to understand perfectly. The connection between them was undeniable, supernatural. That lion was not just a predator. It was an executioner, a guardian of an ancestral justice that she, in her arrogance, had ignored. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint murmur of the river and the sound of the rich woman's own ragged breathing. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry, scratchy. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would explode from her chest, and blood pulsed in her temples. The panic, which had been a wave, was now a tsunami, dragging her into the depths of endless despair. She looked at the dark forest, an impenetrable mass of shadows and mysteries, and at the river, a cold and treacherous current. There was nowhere to go, no glimmer of hope, only the inevitability of that confrontation. The lion, as if enjoying the spectacle of her terror, tilted its head slightly, and then, with a calculated slowness that was more terrifying than any sudden attack, it opened its mouth. Not to bite, not to roar, but to expose a row of white teeth sharp as daggers, while a hissing damp sound escaped its nostrils. It was a warning, a promise of pain, a demonstration of power that the rich woman had never imagined. She felt a shiver run down her spine, a terror so profound that her legs gave way, and she fell sitting in the bottom of the boat, cowering as much as she could. The old woman took another step forward, her eyes fixed on her daughter-in-law. She needed no words. Her gaze, her posture, the presence of the lion by her side, all spoke of a condemnation the rich woman could no longer deny. The price of her betrayal was being exacted, not in money or goods, but in pure, relentless terror. The night was far from over, and the true judgment was just beginning. The lion then did something that made her hold her breath, a movement that sealed her fate with a cold and unshakable certainty. It extended one of its front paws, not to attack, but to touch the edge of the boat, its retractable claws grazing the wood with a soft sound, almost a whisper, but which to the rich woman sounded like the tearing of her own shroud. And now, with its paw firmly supported, it exerted even greater pressure not to capsize the boat, but to push it slowly, millimeter by millimeter, out of the mud, towards the dark current of the river. The boat began to move, dragging itself out of the sticky embrace of the bank, and the rich woman felt panic transform into pure despair. She was not being rescued. She was being delivered. The boat, under the calculated pressure of the lion's paw, began to yield, dragging itself with a damp, nauseating sound out of the sticky embrace of the mud. It was a slow movement, almost imperceptible at first, but for the rich woman, every millimeter was an eternity of terror. She felt the vessel sway, the precarious stability of the bank being replaced by the liquid instability of the river. The cold night air, which previously seemed only an annoyance, now infiltrated her bones, chilling her to the soul. The lion did not withdraw its paw. It kept it firmly supported on the edge, like a macabre helmsman, guiding the boat with unquestionable force. The rich woman could feel the wood creak under the animal's weight, a sound that echoed in her chest, mingling with the frantic beats of her own heart. She tried to grab onto something, anything, but the bottom of the boat was smooth and slippery, and her trembling hands found no support. The panic, which was already a monster, grew with each passing moment, devouring her reason, her ability to think, to react. The boat slid completely off the bank, and the current, previously a distant murmur, now embraced it with a silent and relentless force. The rich woman felt the vessel turn slightly, carried by the dark water. The lion, with a smooth and deliberate movement, withdrew its paw from the edge, but did not move away. It remained on the bank, its red eyes like embers fixed on her, a sentinel of her fate. It was as if it had pushed her to the edge of the abyss and now watched her fall. The old woman, beside the lion, took another step forward, stopping exactly where the boat had been moments before. Her gaze, previously cold and accusing, now carried a depth of sadness, an ancient pain that the rich woman in her selfish blindness had never understood. But there was no forgiveness there, only the recognition of a justice being served. She extended her hand again, not to the lion, not to her daughter-in-law, but to the river, as if she were delivering her to her own punishment. The boat began to drift away, gaining speed in the current. The rich woman turned, desperate, to the bank, to the dark forest that seemed to swallow the moonlight. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry, choked by terror. She tried to row with her hands, scratching the cold, muddy water, but her efforts were useless. The boat was a toy in the hands of the river, and she, a prisoner within it. The lion, majestic and imposing, watched her from afar, its white figure standing out against the darkness of the forest. Its eyes, which seemed to see through the shadows of the night and her soul, showed no anger, only relentless vigilance. It was a predator, yes, but also a judge, an executor of a law that transcends human understanding. It did not need to pursue her. The river would do the work. The rich woman felt the cold of the water penetrate the wood of the boat, rising up her legs, a chilling reminder of the death she had planned for the old woman. The forest banks began to recede, the trees becoming mere indistinct silhouettes. The murmur of the river transformed into a stronger, more menacing sound, a chorus of waters that seemed to whisper her name, calling her to the depths. She looked back one last time at the figures of the old woman and the lion, diminishing in the distance. Their image, standing on the bank under the pale moonlight, etched itself into her mind as a seal of condemnation. There was no turning back, nowhere to run. She was adrift, surrendered to the fate she herself had forged. The river, which was meant to be her mother-in-law's tomb, now became her own path to the unknown, a journey of no return, guided by the current and the shadow of a savage justice. The boat spun again, and the rich woman lost sight of the bank. Now there was only the darkness of the river ahead, the black waters reflecting the few stars that dared to appear. The sound of the current was her only companion, a sound that seemed to mock her despair. She was a dry leaf carried by the flood, an insignificant speck in a vast and indifferent world. The terror was absolute, paralyzing. She didn't know where she was going, what awaited her. The only certainty was that the end was near and there was no salvation. The river, with its relentless coldness, was her purgatory, and the lion, her silent executioner. She was alone, completely alone, adrift in a nightmare she had created. The cold of the night intensified, biting her exposed skin, penetrating her thin clothes. The water, which had previously only brushed the bottom of the boat, now splashed in, wetting her feet, her legs. Each drop was a chilling reminder of the liquid immensity that surrounded her. A damp and deadly embrace. She tried to curl up even further, hugging her knees, but there was no escape from the cold, nor from the darkness. Her eyes, wide open, tried to pierce the blackness, searching for any sign, any light, anything that could indicate a path, a rescue. But there were only dancing shadows, indistinct shapes created by her terrified mind. The murmur of the river, previously a constant sound, began to change. It grew stronger, more turbulent, a distant roar that increased with every second. It was the sound of agitated water, perhaps rapids, perhaps a fall. The panic, which already consumed her, rose to a new level, transforming into a silent scream that tore at her throat. She tried to stand up, stumbling in the unstable boat, looking for a way to stop, to change course. But her hands slipped on the wet wood, and her feet found no purchase. She was powerless, a mere object at the mercy of nature. Her mind, previously so calculating and cold, was now a whirlwind of fragmented images. The old woman's face, serene and accusing, the imposing figure of the albino lion, its red eyes like embers. The bridge, the push, the sound of the body falling into the water. Everything mingled in a cacophony of guilt and fear. She had planned every detail, every step to inherit the fortune, to rid herself of that burden. But the universe, or some ancestral force, had conspired against her, using a mythical beast as an instrument of her ruin. Suddenly, the boat veered violently. The rich woman was thrown against the side, hitting her head hard. A sharp pain shot through her, but it was insignificant compared to the terror that dominated her. She felt the vessel lift, then plunge, as if on an uncontrolled roller coaster. The rapids. She was in the rapids. Water foamed and bubbled around, engulfing the boat, threatening to capsize it at any moment. She could hear the sound of water crashing against rocks, a booming sound that drowned out her own screams of despair. Her body trembled uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from pure terror. She gripped the edges of the boat with desperate strength, her nails scratching the wood, trying to hold on as the vessel was tossed from side to side. Icy water invaded the boat in waves, drenching her completely. She coughed, choking on the water that entered her mouth, tasting earth and death. The darkness was almost total, but she could make out the blurred shapes of the banks, flying past, and the menacing shadows of rocks emerging from the water, ready to shatter the boat. In an instant of terrifying lucidity, she realized that it was not just the river punishing her. It was nature itself. The dark forest watching her from afar, the starless sky that seemed to have closed its eyes to her suffering. She had defied the natural order of things, the life of a helpless old woman. and now she was paying the price. There were no lawyers, no money, no influence that could save her there. Justice was wild, relentless, and she was its next victim. The boat spun again, and she saw, for a brief moment, an opening ahead. It was not a bank nor an exit, it was a drop. The roar of the water became deafening, a continuous thunder that seemed to tear the air. The rich woman felt her stomach churn, her heart leaped to her throat. She was approaching a waterfall, an abyss of water and rocks. The lion did not need to pursue her. The river, its silent accomplice, was completing the work. She closed her eyes, a primal scream escaping her lips, a sound of pure terror and despair. There was nothing left to do, nothing to expect. The fall was imminent, the end, inevitable. In her last seconds of consciousness, she saw again the lion's red eyes, the old woman's serenity, and then the boat plunged. The sound of water impacting against rocks was the last thing she heard, a sound that echoed in her mind as darkness swallowed her completely, dragging her into the icy, relentless depths of the river, the tomb she had planned for another, now her own. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, damp shroud that enveloped her, denser than any night she had ever known. The impact, the sharp pain of the fall, all dissolved in the penetrating coldness of the water, which embraced her with a brutal and indifferent force. She sank, a weightless ragdoll, dragged down by the relentless current and the weight of her own soaked clothes. The air of vital necessity had been stolen from her lungs in the shock, and now, desperately, her body sought the oxygen that was not there. A primordial instinct for survival propelled her. She tried to move her arms, her legs, but her limbs felt heavy, trapped in a liquid melancholy. The water, previously just a distant threat, was now a living entity, a monster with 1,000 arms pulling her into its abyss. Her eyes, open in the darkness, saw nothing but dancing shadows, the turbulence of the water surrounding her. She could feel the increasing pressure in her ears, the cold that infiltrated every cell, paralyzing her from the inside out. Amidst the suffocating panic, fragmented images began to assault her mind. The old woman's face, no longer fragile but serene, almost victorious, hovered in the darkness. The red eyes of the albino lion glowing like embers, not with anger, but with an ancestral wisdom, a silent understanding of the justice unfolding. She saw herself again on the bridge, her hand extended, the push, the muffled sound of the fall, the fortune, the plans, the life of luxury she so coveted, all seemed so distant, so futile now, as death lurked in every drop of water, one last desperate effort. She tried to propel herself upwards, seeking the surface, the light, the air, but the current was too strong, the darkness too deep. She swallowed water, a bitter, muddy wave that burned her throat and invaded her lungs. The pain was excruciating, but the terror was even greater. It was the terror of knowing there was no escape, that the river which she had chosen as an accomplice to her crime now became her executioner. Her body began to give way, strength drained away, replaced by overwhelming exhaustion. Her movements became slow, uncoordinated. Panic gave way to a strange resignation. She was at the mercy of the river, a river that did not forgive, that did not forget. The life she had taken, the life she had tried to steal, now exacted its price. There were no more screams, no more tears, only the deafening silence of the depths. In her last moments of consciousness, she felt a chilling peace, a dark acceptance of her fate. The lion, the guardian of the forest, the executor of savage justice, did not need to soil its paws. The river, with its imposing indifference, completed the work. The rich woman, once so powerful and calculating, was now just another body dragged by the current, a secret the river would keep in its depths forever. On the bank, far above the waterfall, under the pale moonlight that now managed to pierce the clouds, the old woman and the albino lion remained motionless. The roar of the waterfall, was a distant sound, a murmur that mingled with the wind. The old woman, leaning on the lion's paw, watched the spot where the boat had disappeared. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep sadness, the pain of a life marked by betrayal and greed. But there was also a stillness, the serenity of one who witnessed the scales of justice balance. The lion, majestic and imposing, slowly turned its head, its red eyes sweeping the darkness of the river. There was no anger, no satisfaction, only the vigilance of a guardian who had fulfilled its duty. It had been the instrument of a greater force, a reminder that nature has its own laws, its own forms of retribution. The fortune, the inheritance, all that had motivated the rich woman's cruelty now held no meaning. The river had swallowed not only a body, but also the greed, envy, and malice that consumed her. The old woman, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of suffering, finally turned away. The lion, with a smooth and silent movement, began to walk, guiding her back into the darkness of the forest. They disappeared among the trees, leaving behind only the sound of the river, which continued its course, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on its banks. The night was long, and the forest kept its secrets, but one thing was certain: justice, at times, takes unexpected forms, and nature, in its ancestral wisdom, always finds a way to restore balance. The river, a silent witness to everything, continued to flow, carrying with it the last memories of a life consumed by ambition, and leaving behind only the stillness of a night that had seen the end of an era and the beginning of a new peace.